So this comes on the heels of a number of conquests of the Jewish people on the road to the land of Israel. We ended off last week that there were two great kings. They were actually giants called Sichon and Og. Sichon and Og. Sichon was the king of the Amorites, and Og was Melech of Bashan. And it's interesting that we don't find Moses being afraid too often in his life, but there were a couple of times that Moshe was afraid. The Torah tells us that he was fearful. So at the end of one of the final battles that he had, it was against the king of Bashan of Og, and Moshe was concerned because we see that Hashem tells him, "Al tiro," until that's the end of the last week's Torah portion. Do not fear him, and I will give him over to you just like I did to Sichon. Og was a literal giant. The Talmud describes that it wasn't his physical prowess that Moshe was afraid of, but it was a merit that he was being protected by. So I just want to give you just a quick overview as it leads into this Torah portion. The Torah relates that prior to the flood of Noah, we're going back thousands of years, there were actual giants. It was probably the era of dinosaurs and giants. People always ask, are dinosaurs compatible with Jewish history? And it seems that before the flood of Noah, there were species and that did not come back, and that the human beings they lived much longer and they were much larger. There's a Talmud that describes that Og was a survivor of the actual flood. He was so large he didn't fit into the ark, but he held on to the ark, and he survived the flood. He was a giant, to the degree that Moshe was the one who actually struck him. Now, the Talmud says that Moshe himself was no shorty. Moshe was 10 amot tall. 10 amot is approximately 15 feet. An amma can be anywhere from a foot and a half. So there are some opinions that can go up to 22 inches. But Moshe was very, very tall, assuming close to 15 feet tall. The Talmud describes that Moshe had a sword. He leaped with his sword 10 feet, and he hit Og on his ankle, and that's how he brought him down. So if you can imagine how big this Og was. The Talmud, he had this huge sword. The Talmud describes the sword itself was 10 amos. It was a huge 10 to 15 foot sword. Moshe is 15 feet. He jumps, and he gets him by bringing him down by his ankle.
Was Og in the land that became Israel?
No. So Og is in Bashan on the eastern side of the Jordan, and what happened was originally the Jewish people wanted to pass through their land and not touch anything, but the kings would not allow them even passage through the land. They had no choice but to go and fight them. So the commentaries point out what made Moshe concerned was why was Og still living? How was he living so long, and what was his merit? And so the Talmud points out that he was actually the one who came to inform Abraham that Abraham's nephew Lot had been abducted. So there's a story in the beginning of Genesis, the portion of Lech Lecha, that Lot, who had settled at that time in Sodom, in the area of Sodom, right near the Dead Sea, in Israel, was captured and taken captive by the king of, and there was a big battle between 4 kings against 5 kings. I'm not going to go way off topic so early in the night. But the thing is that it says that someone comes, a refugee comes and tells Abraham about that his nephew had been abducted. So Abraham gathers together an ensemble and he goes and he does battle and he frees his nephew and brings him back. So as a credit, this was a merit that Og had, and Moshe was concerned that since he was the one who brought Avram the news that allowed him to free his nephew, that God was still going to protect him. So God told him, "Don't worry, you have nothing to worry about. He's not getting any special protection, and you can go and you can go through that territory, being that they're not allowing you to pass through. Eventually, his land was incorporated into that land was incorporated into greater biblical Israel. That land, after they vanquished this giant oak. So now they're getting closer to the border of Israel, and there's another territory they need to pass through, the plains of Moab, which stand just on the eastern side of the Jordan. The king of that time, the king of Moab at that time, his name is Balak, and he heard about all these, he hears about the different battles that are going on, and that the Jewish people are marching through, and he's fearful that he's next, that he's right in line for them to pass through to Israel, and that they're going to destroy him and take his land. So he's at an impasse, doesn't know what to do. So he does something strange. Rather than try to go to war, as all the other nations that up to that point had been doing, he realized that beating them in physical battle was not going to be successful. He feels that he has to figure out why are the Jews so successful. The Jews are successful because they have some kind of spiritual merit that is helping them. It's not that they're such gifted warriors, because where do they learn warfare? You know, later on, after the Jews entered Israel, they became known as famous Jews. The irony is that early on, we weren't, and for the past 2,000 years, Jews have not made their mark until relatively recently as successful in military matters. But there was a great period after the Jews entered Israel, during the era of the Judges, that Jews were great warriors as well. Nevertheless, Moab realized that the Jewish people are not successful in their battles because of their military prowess. They're having some kind of divine help. So he enlists the help of a prophet, a non-Jewish prophet by the name of Balaam, pronounced in English called Balaam, and he hires him and he says, I want to hire you to put a curse on the Jewish people. In reality, Balak really and the Moabites had nothing to be concerned about. The reason for that is because God had instructed Moshe to leave Moab alone. Moab was not going to be attacked. The Jewish people were not even going to take any land from Moab. The reason for that is that Moab, they were distant relatives. They were distant relatives of the Jewish people themselves, right? And they're from the family of Lot. And Hashem told Moshe that you should know that Moab and Ammon, those two nations, you're not getting their land. That land is an inheritance to those nations from Lot, his children, and you're going to bypass them. But Balak was such a anti-Semite. He was so nervous and he had so much hate that he was blind to this idea that even though the Jewish people were not going to attack him, or were going to leave him alone, he wanted to annihilate them. So he hires this guy Balaam, and who advises him, it seems, that the way we're going to be successful against them is by putting them under a curse. Okay, so the portion of Balak is a fascinating portion, and that is that much of the portion is allegory. The portion of Balak deals with all the intended curses that Balaam wanted to curse the Jewish people, but God does not allow it to happen. And so the narrative of the parsha begins that Balaam wants to accept it, but God comes to Balaam and says, don't go. All right? Don't go. But he really, really wants to go. Why? Because Balak is offering him a lot of money, a lot of reward. Balak says, I'm going to honor you, I'm going to give you a lot of money. I need you to help me curse the Jews.
So when he wants to curse, he's making this arrangement with God?
Well, before this, Balak sends messengers to Balaam, and he invites him to come, which Balaam is only too happy to do. So, but God appears to Balaam, and he tells him, what are you doing? Where are you going? And he says, well, this king Balak sent messengers to come get me, and he wants me to curse these people, and God says, don't go with them, right? God says, don't go with these people. You cannot curse this nation because they are a blessed nation. So the next morning, Balaam tells the messengers that came from the king, I'd love to go with you, but I can't. Why? Because God is telling me not to go, right? So they come back to Balak and they say, listen, we tried to recruit him, but he doesn't want to go because God told him not to go. So he sends him more important dignitaries and he offers him more money, and he says, listen, if you offer me all the money in the world, I still can't go. If God does not let me go, I can't go. But stay here tonight. Maybe God will change his mind. All right? So, in a strange turn, the Torah relates that God tells Balaam, listen, if you want to go, you can go. But you're going to end up speaking the words that I tell you to speak. You have to say what I tell you. So, okay. So there's a lot of commentary on every single one. This is one of the Torah portions that have a lot of commentary on it. So I just want to just think through the basic part of the story, and then we can go deeper a little bit into some parts of this commentary here. It seems that initially God did not want Balaam to go at all, but at some point God relents and lets Balaam go. Why the change? The Talmud tells us that God allows people to go in the direction that they want to go. We know there's a principle of freedom of choice, right? But God tells Balaam, if you're going to go, realize that it's not going to go exactly as you want, but if you want to go, I'm going to let you go. I'm not going to hold you back from going. But God puts many obstacles in his way as he's trying to go. So as you know, one of the most famous stories of the whole Torah is that the next morning Balaam gets up and he takes his donkey, and God sends an angel to stand in front of the donkey and is blocking the donkey's path. Balaam is not sensitive; he cannot see this. He cannot see this angel standing there, but the donkey sees it. The donkey tries to veer to the right. The angel moves to the right. He tries to go to the left. The angel veers, blocks it to the left. Finally, he traps the donkey in a narrow passageway where there's no room to navigate. So the donkey just does what donkeys do, just stubbornly just sits down, right, and it squashes the leg of Balaam right against the wall, and Balaam gets furious and he starts to hit the donkey, and he's striking the donkey, and all of a sudden the donkey starts to speak, and the donkey says, "Why are you hitting me?" Right. So the donkey, so Balaam answers the donkey, "You're lucky I'm only hitting you. If I had a sword on me, I'd kill you. I'd slaughter you." So the donkey tells having a conversation. As long as they're having a conversation, they're talking. The donkey says, "Listen, what are you so angry about? I'm your trusted donkey. I've been your faithful donkey from way back, right? Have I ever done anything wrong to you?" He goes, "No." And finally, Hashem opens Balaam's eyes to see this angel. Obviously, he has to allow him the spiritual sensitivity to see that an angel. An angel's not a physical being, but we know that animals. The Talmud says that animals are more sensitive. They sense angels and demons on a greater level than human beings do. They have better eyesight, but it's not about eyesight. It's not about physical eyesight. They have a greater sensitivity to supernatural energy that's in the world, which human beings are not privy to. The Talmud says, because if we were, it would take away our freedom of choice. We wouldn't be able to function normally. There's a Talmud in the Tractate of Brachos that says that there are mazikim. Mazikim are like dangerous or negative spiritual forces that are all over us all the time. We just don't feel them, but they're constantly buzzing around the world. And the Talmud describes if you hear dogs barking at night, it's because they're sensitive to it. But human beings, we don't feel it. Anyway, so God allows him to see this angel, And so all of a sudden he apologizes. The angel says, "What are you hitting your donkey? The donkey did nothing to you. What are you hitting it 3 times?" And so Balaam says, yeah, he didn't realize. As he apologizes and he tells the angel, I didn't. If I'm offending God, if you want me to turn back, I'll go back home." And he says, "No. We see you're very determined to get your financial reward for going. You can go, but remember, we're going to put words in your mouth, and the words that we're going to put in your mouth, that's the words you're going to say." There is in Ethics, in Pirkei Avot, in chapter 5 of Ethics of Fathers, it mentions that there were a number of things that were created bein hashmashot. Bein hashmashot means between dusk and nightfall. As we know, God created the world in 6 days, and it's God rested on the seventh. But the Mishnah, the Talmud says that there were a number of things that were created what we would call last minute, just before, just under the bar, so to speak. One of the things that God created the last minute was piha aton, the mouth of the donkey. And God created the potential for this animal to speak way off into the future. Why? Bein hashmashot represents a time that it's not clear whether it's day or night. So, just for a few seconds, let me explain the Jewish legality. You ever wonder why we light candles on Friday while it's still light, and we end Shabbat while it's still dark? A day can only be 24 hours. It can't be more than that. So, why is it that all Jewish Shabbats and all Jewish holidays are longer than that? The answer is that there is a complication in our understanding of what the legality of day and night is. Now, we know day and night, but there's a period of time, which is approximately 1 hour, where on a halachic level, we are not sure if that part belongs to the day or belongs to the night. The technical term, bein hashmashot, translates literally as in between the constellations, or between, right, the servers. A shamash, like on Hanukkah, you have a shamash on your menorah. What does a shamash do? It serves the other lights. Since you cannot light from one candle to another candle, we have a shamash that serves that you use to light the other candles. Synagogues used to have what's called a shamash, a sexton. He was in Hebrew called a shamash, right? Why? His job was service of the show, right? So the sun and the moon are called shamashim. Why? Or mashot? Because they are God's faithful stewards in running the cycle of day and night, right? And so, bein hashmashot means in between the time that the sun goes down, but before the moon fully comes out, because they take turns. But there's a short period of time when it's no man's land, or both man's land, so to speak, and so it's a time when is it day or is it night? So, halacha tells us that God knows the moment when day is over and night begins, but human beings don't. It's arbitrary on some level. So when it comes to biblical laws, we are stringent on both sides. When it comes to rabbinic things that are time related, we are less stringent. We can be more lenient. So for example, Shabbat, it's possible that Shabbat is actually beginning, and we know it cannot begin before sundown. But once Shkia happens, once sunset happens, it's possible that now it's night. It's also possible that day is going on for about another hour until it gets fully dark, until the stars come out, which in Hebrew is called Tzet HaKochavim. Tzet HaKochavim is fully night. There's no dispute that that's when night is. But that 1 hour, since we are not sure, we start Shabbat. We light our candles and begin Shabbat at sunset. But for Shabbat to be over and to resume since we don't know, maybe night really only begins at nightfall, not at sunset. Therefore, we wait until it's fully dark for Shabbat to be over. This Sunday is a fast day. It's the 17th day of Tammuz. It's actually supposed to be on Saturday, the 17th day, but it's postponed since we don't fast on Shabbat unless it's Yom Kippur. So the fast day, I was actually considering doing a class on the fast days, because there are 2 fast days coming up in the next 3 weeks. We're actually entering a period that's starting this weekend called the 3 weeks, and since I'm not here next week, we're going to go right through it, but the week after that, hopefully we'll have a discussion about that. There are 4 rabbinic ordained fasts that the prophets ordained that are regarding the destruction of the temples. The first temple and the second temple some 400, almost 500 years later. And that was the first one destroyed by the Babylonians, and 586 BCE. The second one was destroyed 69 CE by the Roman Empire, and but there are 4 fast days that we have in our calendar. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. The first one is the 10th of Tevet. I'm doing it chronologically. The 10th of Tevet is the shortest fast day of the year. It always falls usually in December, in January, depending on the calendar. That's the day when the Babylonian Empire, Nebuchadnezzar, laid siege around Jerusalem for the first time, and it started a 2.5-year, almost 3-year siege that culminated with the fall of Jerusalem. Some 2.5 years later, on the 17th day of Tammuz, which starts this weekend, the 17th day is the Shabbat, the Babylonians finally breached the walls of Jerusalem. So for 2.5 years there was a siege, and to weaken the city. And on the 17th day of Tammuz was when the walls were broken through. For 3 weeks there was absolute destruction and mayhem, which exactly 3 weeks later, on the 9th of Av, is when the fire was actually set to the temple in Jerusalem and it was burnt to the ground. So the sages ordained that all of those days were fast days. They are sunrise to sunset fast days, not 24 hours, except for the one on the 9th of Av, Tisha B'Av. But if you look at your calendar, you'll notice that the fast ends sometimes slightly earlier on those days, and they end on Yom Kippur and on a Shabbat. And that is because since they are rabbinic fasts, we don't actually have to wait until the unanimous time of all the stars coming out. We actually ended a little earlier, a rabbinic ordained time. But it's important just to know about these dates in general, about what's coming up. So this coming Sunday, it is tradition, as long as obviously you're healthy, et cetera, to fast. But this year it's interesting that since these fasts all occur on Shabbat, the 9th of Av is also on Shabbat, and so they're all postponed to the following Sunday. There's an opinion in the Talmud that the Rabbi Yehuda, the author of the Mishnah, wanted to postpone it entirely. He said whenever it falls on a Shabbat and you can't fast and it gets postponed, then we should postpone it and forget about it. But the Chachamim, the majority of the sages, did not agree with him, and they said no, we have to make it up on Sunday, and that was the final halacha. So, but the reason that it's important is because the Jews, we live with history in a very, very current way. One of the secrets of Jewish survival is that we have what's called active memory. And that is that we live today, but with a lot of emotion and fuel of the past. And I told this before. It's a famous story that during the French conquest of Russia, when Napoleon was invading Russia in the early 1800s, it was on Tisha B'Av when he came into a shul, and he saw that there were people sitting on the floor crying, and he wasn't sure if it had to do with the fact that they were losing the war, or what he was going to do to them, and so he asked, "Why are you crying?" Because he was liberating in his mind. He was bringing freedom to people of Russia, and they told him that we're not crying because of the war. We're crying because the synagogue, our temple, was destroyed. So he asked him, where? Who destroyed your temple? Let's go get them. So I explained to him, no, it's not. It's a long time ago. It was the Romans, almost 2,000 years ago, and he was absolutely amazed that 2,000 years later there are people who sit on the floor and mourn something that they never saw, they never went to, and it's been passed down to them through tradition, and it impacts their lives. And so he said that it's obvious to me that people who can sit 2,000 years and mourn for something like that will survive to get it back one day, if they miss it that much. So this is why these fast days are so important for us, because it's not about it's hard for us to appreciate what the temple represents. We've seen it how's it relevant to our lives, but it's the idea is that if you want something back, the way you show that you miss it tells us a lot about how much you feel connected to it. And so these, I only mentioned this one's coming up this Sunday, but it's important to realize the difference between how we judge time on a biblical law and for rabbinic law. So Bein Hashmashot, going back to our original discussion, is that period of time when we're not sure. So the Talmud, the Mishnah writes that God created in that brief window of time just before Shabbat was coming in, God created the potential for the fact that this donkey is going to speak. Balaam's donkey is going to speak so many years later. But we'll get back to that in a couple of minutes. Which, to finish the story, eventually Balaam goes, and Balak is thrilled that the prophet is coming. And the rest of the parsha deals with that. He takes him to a place where they can see the Jewish people camping out, and they make an altar, and they start offering. They start calling on the gods of the idols to bless them in their endeavor, and so Balaam begins his first. He says, I want to start to curse them, but I can't curse them. Why? Because they are a blessed nation. I see them from the height of Surim, of mountains and from tall canopies. And Balak is getting all incensed. He goes, I hired you to curse them, and you're blessing them instead. What's going on here? And he says, listen, I told you I have no control of what I'm going to say. The words that are coming out of my mouth are being pushed into my mouth, right? So Balak thinks maybe it's the location. If I take you, if I take you geographically to a different place, maybe the message is going to change. And the rest of the parsha deals with that. Balak keeps moving him around to different strategic points, and to look at the Jewish people in different places. But instead of curses that are coming out, every time Balak opens up his mouth, more blessings are coming. Every time Balaam opens his mouth, more blessings are coming out. And what's interesting is that many of our prayers and many of the blessings that we use in our prayer come from this parsha, and are the words that Balaam says. Matovu. We start our blessings, our morning blessings every morning. Matovu aholecha Yaakov mishkenotecha Yisrael. That Balaam says that how good are the tents of Jacob, mishkenotecha Yisrael, your dwelling places, your mishkan. He called their dwelling place literally a mishkan, which is a term of tabernacle that we use for our temple. This is the basic idea that every Jewish home is meant to emulate a mishkan, the actual tabernacle that Moshe erected in the desert. As long as we're mentioning that, Rashi quotes the Talmud. What was so impressive of the way that he saw the Jewish people's tents out in the desert that it compelled him to praise, to bless the fact that how wonderful are your tents and your homes. So Rashi points out that the Jewish people were so sensitive to each other. Imagine there are several million people living in a very confined space in a tent community. Nevertheless, what they did was, in order to give privacy to every family, each one aligned their tent, that the opening of their tent should not be facing the opening of somebody else's tent. So every tent was slightly was aligned in a way that no one can see into each other's. Now it seems, what's the big deal about that? People want privacy, right? But the Talmud points out that the fact that the Jewish people were so sensitive to each other that nobody was nosy, and each person wanted to give, wasn't for themselves, but that they wanted to give respect and honor to their neighbors, so impressed Balaam that he saw that there was a special blessing that the Jewish people, number one, were modest in their personal lives, that everything they did inside was private, but that they afforded that same privacy to everybody else, to all their neighbors. So there's the Arizal writes that before one says Matovu, one should add a line, Hareini mekabel alai mitzvat hasei v'yahavta l'recha kamocha. And it's printed in many editions of the Siddur, that before one prays that prayer, one should say, I accept upon myself the commandment of the Torah, I love my fellow Jew as myself. And he says that it's obvious that what happened at that time was that the Jewish people had such love for each other that they treated their friend just like they would want to be treated themselves. And so the Arizal writes that before you pray in the morning, it's appropriate to say this line. Why? Because he says that before you pray for yourself, one should always have in mind the welfare of somebody else. There's a famous teaching in the Talmud that if you need something, you want something, and you know somebody else that might need or want the same thing, you should pray for them rather than just pray for yourself. Praying for somebody else is more meritorious than just praying for yourself. Not that praying for yourself is selfish. God wants you to pray. The basic idea of prayer is that God wants us to ask for things. But when God sees that we are just as concerned or more concerned with the needs of somebody else, so the Talmud says if you need the same thing, pray for some. If two people, you and your friend, both need the same thing, pray on behalf of your friend, and you'll get it too. But rather than just pray for yourself. So the Arizal writes that's appropriate before you pray. Before you pray in the morning, tell God that I really care about other people. I'm not just here in the morning for myself. I care about everybody else. It'll make your prayers go further. So this goes on and on. As a matter of fact, I would say that one of the commentaries point out that the first blessing, curse, so to speak, that Balaam begins with is with, he says, Ki meirosh surim mer'enu u'mikvot asherenu, from the top of so pages in here. On page 865, to the bottom of the page, that's the beginning of his first prophecy. He says, how can I curse the Jewish people if God has not cursed them? And he says, Ki meirosh tzur me'enu mikvot asherenu, from the top of heights of mountains I see them, and from mikvot asherenu, and he translates Gvot are smaller mountains. So Rashi points out that what is the meaning that he sees them from the top of mountains? It's a reference to who are the mountains of the Jewish people. It's our matriarchs and patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. That they're the ones who are the protective shell of the Jewish people. Balaam sees that one of the secret of Jewish survival is not our own merit. You know, when we pray, how do we begin praying with Amidah? With the most important prayer for a person to eat?
Blessing Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Right? We start off, Elokeinu, Velokei Avatenu, Elokei Abraham, Elokei Yitzchak, Velokei Yaakov. We always begin our prayer with invoking the merit of our ancestors. Where do we even know to do this ourselves? Moses himself did it. When God was angry at the Jewish people, Moses said, Moshe appealed to God and says, remember Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember the sacrifice of the patriarchs and the matriarchs. Right? This is something called Zchut Avot. It's the merit of our ancestors. That they were willing to sacrifice at the time and go into the unknown. And so we always invoke their merit. So Balaam saw that even though the Jewish people at that time maybe were not full of merit themselves, reading all the stories of the previous portions where they complained and they sinned time and time again, but he sees that they're not vulnerable because they're being protected by some great merit from their past. Okay, yeah.
So, how is it that God communicates? I thought you had communicated earlier that God was only communicating to the Jews, but now he's communicating to this other person.
I don't know if I said the only communication to the Jews. The Talmud discusses why did God communicate with Balaam. It says that God wanted that the other nations should not come later and say, well, you know what? If you would have given us somebody like Moses, if you read the stories, as I said, the Jewish people don't seem too extraordinary. They had Moses who saves them time and time again. So Moshe always appeals to God to save the Jewish people. It's after the golden calf and the story of the spies, and each time when they're complaining about the manna and the water. And so God, so to speak, is indulging the Jewish people, it seems, from the narrative of many of the stories, in the merit of Moshe. So the nations said that if we would have, a Moshe, a Moses, that you would talk to, and you would reveal, and you would give him prophecy, we would be just as good. So God gave them somebody of that stature that God communicated with. So to show that they had every option, but they still did not choose to live moral lives. But there is a key difference in the way God communicates to Balaam, the way God communicates to Moshe and the other prophets. Maimonides points out that, number one, even between Moshe and all the other prophets, there is a key distinction. It's in the 13 Principles of Faith, how God communicated to Moshe. Moshe was able to be conscious. God communicated to Moshe in a way that the Torah describes as like face to face, panim el panim, adaber bo. That God would talk to him the way a person talks to their friend. All the other prophets, God did not communicate to him that way. Whether it was Samuel, or Ezekiel, or Isaiah, or Amos, or Ezra, Nehemiah, go through all the prophets, God speaks to them in a couple of ways. Either in a dream state, it happened to them it came to them in a dream, or it came to them in a subconscious way where they would lose control of their body, and they would be lying on the floor, and they would be trembling, and God would communicate to them in a way that it would be almost like an outer-body experience.
And they like seizures, huh?
A seizure, similar to a seizure, yeah. They would be literally rolling on the floor, and they would because the idea is that the greater the spiritual revelation, if your body cannot handle the body loses itself in the rapture, the soul overwhelms it. Moshe had the unique ability that his body was able to maintain its equilibrium.
But God never speaks with Moshe face to face. I mean, he doesn't, because Moshe. We know that Moshe. The only thing that Moshe, because God says nobody can see me, and so then the only thing that Moshe says, the only thing that Moshe sees is the back of the knot on his tefillin.
Doesn't mean that they saw face to face. Speaking face to face in the language of Torah, God doesn't speak. God doesn't have a mouth.
Right, okay.
What it means is that God communicated to Moshe that Moshe in a face to face in the way that Moshe was able to be part of the conversation. Moshe was able to respond.
But he doesn't see God's face.
There's no face. There is no face, right? God doesn't have a form. God doesn't have an image.
Just wanted clarification.
Yeah. Face to face means that Moshe is maintaining his independence and he's conversing in a normal way, the way two people can have a conversation. Right. Non-face to face means that it's a one-way conversation, and that you are not there. That it's something is being given to you. It's a message that you wake up with.
So okay, so then if we want to take that a step.
And I would say if you read the time of the Ten Commandments, right, God wanted to give that vision to all the Jewish people at the same time, but the Jewish people came to Moses and said, we can't handle it. Right. They said, you go to Hashem, you get the Torah, because it's so overwhelming for us. Our souls are leaving our bodies, and we can't handle it.
Okay, so then how does Abraham argue with God? Because he argues with him to reduce the number of people in order to save Sodom and Gomorrah.
All the prophets speak to God too. Isaiah talks to God. Jeremiah speaks to God. They communicate with God, but it's not a communication that's going back and forth instantaneously. That like two people having a conversation is what my mind is saying. Okay. They're getting the revelation in a lower form of way.
Although from the way that it sounds when Abraham is arguing with God, it's almost, it comes across, at least from the way that I read it, it comes across as a face-to-face conversation.
Correct. So
or as a conversation.
I would say until Matan Torah, right, it seems that Avram was able to have conversations that way. Okay. What Maimonides points out is from the time of Moshe and on, we don't find prophecy on that same level anymore, anyone besides Moshe. Abraham was able to have a conversation with God. Whether it was the same way that Moshe had a communication with God, it's not clear. But yes, it definitely seems that Abraham was going back and forth with God instantaneously. The only thing I would add, the difference between the way God communicated with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the way God communicated with Moshe was, so in Kabbalah it explains that God communicated to the patriarchs and matriarchs was much more of an emotional connection, whereas with Moshe it was more of an intellectual so God speaks to Moshe, God's giving Moshe instruction, God's teaching Moshe law. The conversations of all the conversations that you have with the patriarchs and matriarchs with God, it's much more of an emotional nature. God is asking them to do things, and they're responding. So Avram is questioning God's sense of justice for Sodom. Abraham is questioning whether he's really going to have a child in his old age. Jacob is questioning why God is punishing him in this way. Why he has to suffer. So we've done classes in the past about this. I don't have to go back to the archives, but in Kabbalah it explains the difference between Moshe and the patriarchs and matriarchs is that Moshe was an intellect. He was an intellectual, so to speak. That's why God chose him to be the emissary of giving the Torah, because the Torah is God's wisdom, it's God's mind, so to speak. The patriarchs and matriarchs were the heart, the emotion of the Jewish people, and emotion always comes first, right? We are born with emotion. Intellect comes later. So in the chronology of human life, we are born with feelings that we can't articulate why we feel this way. So you can viscerally love or hate something or fear something, even if you don't understand why. Babies can feel love, even if they cannot articulate or understand why they have love or fear of certain things. Intellect comes later on, where we can understand why it is that we feel certain things, or learn to feel certain things, teach ourselves to structure feelings around certain things, even if it's not always rational. So Kabbalah says that the patriarchs and matriarchs come first, the Avot and the Imot, because they're our emotional, that's our emotional connection to God. Moshe is our intellectual connection to God. So that's why we find that throughout the stories, all the stories of Genesis, you don't find ever the patriarchs or matriarchs complaining or questioning God, right? They never complain about why things are difficult. Abraham never says, God, how come I have no children? Life's still so hard. Why do I have to go to Egypt and there's a hunger? And Jacob never cries out to God, why is my life so bitter? My brother wants to kill me, and Joseph disappeared. I mean, they had very, very hard lives, right? Rachel dies at 36 years old in childbirth, giving birth to Benjamin. We don't find Jacob one time saying, God, woe is to me. Moshe, on the other hand, every time something goes wrong, he wants to know, he's telling God, I can't handle it anymore. To kill me, I can't do this by myself anymore, right? So, but it's a difference. You see how God structures the history of the Jewish people, and that is that the rock, the foundation of the Jewish people is not Moshe. Moshe comes much later on. The foundation of the Jewish people are the patriarchs and matriarchs, because they teach us about faith and about having a strong emotional connection. An emotional connection means that I can feel something even if I don't understand it. So, as an example, a child, if you look at the relationship with parents and children, a parent can be upset or disappointed at their children, but it doesn't mean they love them less, right? So they can punish them, but even when they're punishing them, it comes through love. And there's Kabbalah proves it. It says, you see this all the time. Sometimes a parent punishes a kid. The kid says, "Oh, I hate you," right? And 30 seconds later, the parent gives them a lollipop, and they come, "I love you," right? It's an extraordinary emotional bonding. You see sometimes that even a child comes and wants love or wants a hug from the very parent that's giving them the discipline. Because on an emotional level, or it's a subconscious level, they understand that even though my parent just punished me, right, they still love me, right? It doesn't make it, but the older we get, it doesn't work the same way. It happens much more when we're infants or babies, right? We actually run to a parent for a hug, is even though 10 seconds ago we were very, very angry, very upset. The older we get, it takes much longer to get over the fact when we feel hurt, it takes us much longer to get over it. Why? Because it's our intellect now that's overriding our emotion. Because emotionally we can accept disappointment, anger, and love all in the same space. Because they're not really contradictions. You can feel that a single heart can love and be angry at exactly the same time. In our mind, it doesn't make sense. So the older we get, we say, yeah, I want to make peace, or I want to reconcile with that person, but I'm not ready to do that yet. I want them to apologize first, or I want them to do this first, right? And sometimes we stand our ground on a principle, right? And we've discussed many times the difference between children and adults. Children get into fights. You ever see it happens all the time? I see with my own kids. And 2 minutes they beating the who knows out of each other. 30 seconds later I walk in and they're reading a book together and they're holding hands. What? You ever see adults get into a fight, right? Unfortunately, it's a sad comment. There are adults who are fighting 50 years about something, and you ask them why. They can't remember. They remember something. Someone said something 50 years ago, and they didn't invite them to the grandson's bar mitzvah or something like that, and they never forgave them for that, right? Adults, right? Why? Why do kids get over that? They can get over so quickly. So there are a number of reasons for that. But number one is because emotion has a way, because they're not dealing with intellect. Intellect is really what's holding us back, right? We're saying, I can't admit that I'm wrong, or I'm not going to be the first one to apologize. Or my sense of shame or my sense of dignity is at stake. And kids don't have all those calculations. In the language of the language that Kabbalah uses is that it says children choose to be happy over being right, and adults always choose right over being happy. We'd rather be right? Say I'm right and that person's wrong, even if it makes me miserable, right? So okay, you're right? But kids also want to be right all the time, but deep down they cherish being happy, even if I'm going to say, okay, that guy was right, I'm wrong. Adults have a much harder time to do that. Why am I even going into this? Why we got down this rabbit hole? But the point I wanted to make is that we're talking about why Balaam saw the power and the protection of the Jewish people are the patriarchs and matriarchs. He doesn't mention Moses. He mentions the patriarchs and matriarchs. Moses is the protection now, but Moses is not really the protection of the Jewish people. It's why? Because the emotion, the staunch faith of the Jewish people does not come from Moses. Moshe teaches the Jewish people how to think, how to analyze, how to study. He's their teacher. I've told you in the past that in Hebrew we have terms. Moshe is called Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe is called Moshe Rabbeinu. Rabbeinu means our teacher, our rabbi. What do we call Avram and fathers and mothers? What's a father and a mother? A father and a mother can also be a teacher. A teacher can also be a parent. They're not mutually exclusive. But the difference is that a parent's relationship with their children is genetic, and it's based on emotion. A parent can, right? You can't. It's not a logical relationship. A teacher's relationship with a student is based on the information. It's based on what I'm teaching you. It's not based upon. It's not an emotional relationship. It's an intellectual relationship. You can build on it emotionally, but the foundation of it is through the mind. So Moshe's relationship with the Jewish people is a mind relationship. The patriarchs and matriarchs is an emotional soul relationship. And so Balaam says, I can't curse the Jewish people because they have a protection that is not logical. You see, what was going on here? What's going on here is that logically the Jewish people were not deserving of the special protection, because logically they're like everybody else. They sin, they make mistakes. What Balaam realizes is that the Jewish people don't have a logical relationship with God. Where does that come from? It comes from the Avot and the Imahot. They taught us how a Jew can be so illogical that we cling to our roots and to our values even when we don't understand why. So he tries again and again and again but each time God is giving him blessings. What is the metaphor? Why does God, I mentioned earlier, why does God, if God did not want him to go, God told him not to go, he wouldn't have gone. Why the whole charade? So one of the things that Kabbalah discusses is that the greatest light, the greatest blessings come through transformation. The greatest love comes from transforming an enemy into a friend, transforming darkness into light. It's an imagination about the whole purpose of why the Jewish people have gone into exile. What's the story of creation? Why did God create this whole process where we went to Israel, we went out of Israel, and then we came back, and then we're gone, and thousands of years later, what is the destiny of history? What does God want from us? So Kabbalah says, as much as we can figure it out, it seems that the journey of the Jewish people is about transforming negativity into something positive, or darkness into light. That the only way you can create something that's greater than perfect, the only way you can perfect perfection is by creating the possibility for the opposite and then transforming that. It's almost like creating an artificial competition in order to propel yourself to achieve something. So, to use an analogy, great athletes can only be great athletes if they have a foil, if they have a competition over which to succeed. If there's no, or for example, superheroes, right? If you don't have a good villain, well, the whole idea of a superhero doesn't make any sense. The greater the villain, the greater the superhero. So he says, but let's say there will be no villains. We couldn't create this idea of having superheroes. So and there's a balance. In tandem is the greater the mystery, the greater the opposition, it creates the possibility for a much greater counter. And so Kabbalah understands that if the purpose of light, right, the greatest light is, if the purpose of the world is to bring light into this, God's light into the world, the greatest possible way to do that is to create a reverse process that from that becomes light. That light is a much more powerful light than just having light. So if you you just flick on a light, it's great. But a dark room that then becomes light is a much more powerful light. There's a line in the Talmud that says, Shraga Batira Me'ar Hani. Shraga Batira means, if you light a candle in the middle of the day, you barely see the flame, right? Go outside and light a candle. The candle is hardly discernible in the middle of the daytime. But that same candle at night has an unbelievable glow, right? Why? Because the power of light is much more powerful when its greatest purpose is realized, when it's transforming something that's the opposite of darkness around it. So what does God do? God created a world that's in opposition to spirituality. He created human beings with an evil inclination that seems more powerful than our good inclination. He created a world where there's a lot more darkness than there's light. And he says, now I want you not to bring more light, but to transform the very darkness into light. So there's two processes. One is that you can just bring light. One is to figure out, how am I going to take the negativity itself and make it something positive? Not avoid it, but realize that there's something powerful in the opposition. So making an enemy into a friend, making darkness into light, is something that is much more transformative than just figuring out how to live with negativity, but still remain positive. So what is God, what's the blessing? God can choose to give blessing to the Jewish people, but the blessing that's even more profound is that an enemy's praise that's coming from Balaam, right? So you ask a person, if two people give you a compliment, Judy, one is your close friend, and one is your boss who fired you, who can't stand you, and has been your enemy your whole life, and then you find out that they really, really admired you. Which one would make you feel much better? Your friend's compliment or your enemy's compliment?
Well, I'd be thinking, how can those two things fit together?
Okay. You're giving me a logical response, but emotionally, right? Emotionally, right? We always, I think it's a famous saying. It says, pay attention to what your enemies are saying about you, because they hold vital secrets your friends are keeping from you, right? Because when there's a certain feeling that our friends are going to say things that we want to hear, right? But something that that someone has no reason to say that means, oh, it must be the truth. It must be the real me, right? But the getting a blessing from Moshe, getting a blessing from Abraham is one thing. Getting a blessing from Balaam, right? That's a much greater blessing.
But Balaam wasn't choosing the words, right? So, I mean, what does it matter that Balaam was the vessel? Like, yes, he had intended to speak curses, but he didn't choose then to.
But it seems that for that time, he did have choice, and he chose to say those words. He didn't have to say anything. He can choose to be quiet and not say those words. At the time that he says them, he's fully cognizant of the words that he's saying, and he chooses to say them.
But doesn't it? Balak tells him not to curse or bless.
Right.
He says.
I told you the words that God puts in my mouth, those are the words that I'm going to say. Right?
But that's a choice that he's making.
It's a choice that he's making, that he's going to say those words. Right?
I understand now. I see, yeah.
So,
Would he have received any money had he not said anything? That's my question. Or money or whatever it was that he received. Treasure.
Well,
I think Rashi mentions early on that it,
House full of silver and gold.
what was that?
A house full of silver and gold.
House for silver and gold. It says that here we see that Balaam really loved money. What's the like language that he
Bill was a Khazir.
That they use
He's a
the
Chazir.
specific like unit
He's
shows that
greedy.
it's not just a promise vaguely of a lot of wealth, but it's
well, no, they didn't promise him a whole house of silver and gold. They just promised to enumerate him. There's going back to Pirkei Avot. There's a story that Pirkei Avot that says that whether the Talmud is the mission is discussing that a person should always choose to live in a place that has Torah. If you have a choice where to live, make sure you live in a place where you can study Torah, right? So the Talmud says there was a guy, his name was Rabbi Yossi ben Kisma. He says he was once traveling, and a person approaches him, and it says, where he asks him, "Man, where are you from?" So he answers him, "I come from this city. It's full of rabbis, full of scholars." So the guy tells Rabbi Yossi Kisma, "We don't have any where we live. We'd like you to come live with us. We need rabbis. Come." So he says, so the guy tells him, "If you come, we're going to give you all the wealth and this and that." It's right. So he says he can give you all the money. It's not going to help. I'm not going to live only in a place where there's a place where I can study Torah. So the commentaries ask, why is that story different than here? Why is that rabbi seen in a positive light of Balaam? Each one responds, if you give me all the money in the world, I'm only going to do what God says. But that rabbi is lauded for saying that all the money in the world is not going to change him. Do we consider here? See the difference in the language. Right, so Rabbi Yosef ben Kisma says, he goes, if you come live with us, I'm going to give you elef alafim dinrei zav abundant. I'm going to give you thousands upon thousands of golden dinars, precious stones, and pearls. He itemizes everything he's going to give him. So he answers him, if you give me all the gold and silver and gems in the whole world, I'm not coming with you. And he quotes from King David in Psalms, it says that your Torah is more precious to me than thousands of gold and silver. And then he says, you know why? Because when a person passes away, do you know what escorts you into the next world? Not your money, not your gold and silver. The only Torah, Masantom, only Torah and your good deeds, that's the only thing that's going to go with you into the grave and speak for you in the world to come. So he says, I don't care. So here, they offer Balaam. They tell Balaam, if you come, we're going to greatly honor you and reward you. But they don't tell him they don't itemize what they're going to give him. Balaam and his answer, this is the reason why Rashi writes what he writes. They told Balaam, if you come, we're going to reward you. So what does Balaam say? If you give me a full house full of gold and silver, so right away Rashi says his mind got ahead of him. He was already imagining what the reward might be. Here, the person tells him what he wants to give him, so he says, "You can give me that plus more. I'm not going to accept it." But Balaam seemingly was initially out for the money, but by the end, the money is not important anymore. He's so evil. He wants to curse the Jewish people regardless. And when he was unsuccessful, the end of the Torah portion is that he gives Balak advice about how to cause the downfall of the Jewish people, when he realizes that it's not going to happen through his powers of prophecy, of blessing and curses. And so he tells Balak that the Jewish people can only self-destruct. So, but it's not, we cannot fight them from the outside, but when they have discord amongst themselves, and when they sin, that's when they become vulnerable.
And isn't there a difference between, like, relating with kind of love, where you, even if you see negative things, you feel love, you feel acceptance, versus not, or faith, love or faith, versus if you're not in that state and you're judging everything. Those are two completely different states.
But what would be? I understand, but what would be the difference?
What would be the difference? Because Balaam was in a state of connected to God, right?
So Balaam was not connected to God. God gave Balaam a gift that he'd be able to communicate messages.
You don't think that Balaam had any feelings about God?
So the way God communicated to Balaam was the language the Torah uses is Vayikar Hashem, that God appeared to Balaam, but God would appear to him suddenly. With other prophets, God would give them advance notice that he was going to communicate with them. The difference is that, in the sense that God spoke to Balaam, but it was in a way of disdain. But God spoke to Balaam, and so in order that that those nations would have someone who had revelations from God, so they cannot claim that God did not communicate with them. But Balaam was not of a stature that God spoke to him. It didn't come about in a spiritually holy way.
But Balaam had this experience, and it must have had an effect on him.
But it doesn't. Balaam lived till the end with hatred not of the Jewish people, but hatred of all things holy. Balaam himself was eventually killed.
But that's really a contradiction, isn't it?
Why?
Because he had this direct experience of God, and how could he not have had some reaction to that?
You can have a reaction. He has a reaction. His reaction was denial. Theoretically, a Jew can have that same reaction. You have a soul that comes from God, but you can deny it, and you can reject, and you can choose to deny the very gift that God is giving you. That's what choice is. Choice means that even God communicates with you, even God shares with you, but a person has the choice to say, I reject it. I don't want to. That's what choice is about.
That's what's been
Balaam,
happening.
by the way, Balaam comes from, I was just saying, it's brought down in one of the books of Kabbalah that Balaam was a descendant of Amalek.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Amalek is a spiritual idea of rejection of all things holy, and they say that if one of the ways.
So Balaam was an unwilling prophet.
So Balaam. They say if you write Balaam, right, and you write Amalek.
Mm.
I put a line down here, and you can read Balaam, Amalek. You see how the word, the names are, the two words Balaam and Amalek are really combined from each other. So you can read Balaam and Amalek this way, and this way. It's the same word.
So he was an unwitting prophet.
Huh?
He was an unwitting
Do
prophet.
you get what this? You got that?
That's good.
So Balaam is the continuation of Amalek. Amalek was the nation that attacked the Jewish people, and it's considered the eternal spiritual nemesis of the Jewish people, which is why we have the positive commandment to erase the name of Amalek, right? So Balaam is Amalek in that generation.
So he communicated the things God wanted him to communicate.
Sorry for my sloppy.
Unwittingly, right?
Huh?
Better than mine.
Unwittingly, he didn't really want to communicate it, but
Correct.
he never threw himself into it. It was against his will.
Why does Balaam use the language Hashem, my God? Isn't that kind of indicate that he likes the Jewish people or something?
Which line are you talking about?
That's
What
verse
page?
18. Well, page 859, 858.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
Verse 18.
Yeah. Hashem Elokai.
So many of the commentaries talk about exactly that. Talk about that as well. I'll share with you a couple of things that they say here. 1 second. So one of the commentaries points out as follows. It says at this point,
Good catch, man.
so one of the commentaries points out at this point, he did not know that God was going to force him to say something else. So this is all the way at the beginning of the story. So he was excited. He was excited that he was going to be rewarded. So that time, he's calling God Elokai because God's going to allow him to get the reward for going along. It's only later on when God says you cannot say anything except that what I tell you to say, that he realizes that he was mistaken, so he retracts from the fact that he calls God at that point. It's my God. Why? Because I'm going to cash in my chips now. God is allowing me to get rewarded at this point.
So is it during this parsha that Balaam becomes hateful of the Jews?
It can be, because if not, Balak hired him.
Oh, okay.
Because he was known to be from Amalek.
So is it then in this portion or during this time that Balaam then decides to hate all things holy? I mean, it sounds like there's a transition that goes on based on the interpretations and the commentaries.
Balaam certainly was known to be a rabid anti-Semite and a prophet and a.
Well, he advised Paro.
He was one advised to Pharaoh. Balaam was one of the ones who. Now, Balaam was the one who advised Pharaoh on the plan of extermination of the Jewish people. He's the one that told Pharaoh to throw the babies into the Nile.
What was he doing in Egypt?
He was the Medrash records that Pharaoh had three main advisors who advised him on national policy, right? He had.
Fair enough.
He had not Karl Rove. He had.
Close enough.
He had Balaam. Jethro, Yitro, and he had Job. Those were his three main advisors. When it came time to decide what to do with the Jewish question, the Talmud tells us that Job was silent, and Yitro stood up to defend the Jewish people, and Balaam was the one who said to throw them into the Nile and to annihilate them. And the Talmud says that each one was punished measure for measure. Yitro, who was the only one who defended the Jews, eventually his daughter becomes Moshe's father-in-law, who saves the Jews. Job, who was quiet and didn't say anything for or against, is punished to be the silent sufferer. He suffers, right? He loses everything. The story of Job is about someone who has to suffer and acknowledge God's justice, and he wants to cry out, but no one's listening because he was quiet when the Jewish people were crying out, and he didn't feel their pain.
Job was in Egypt?
Job was in Egypt. And Balaam, who was the mastermind of Pharaoh's plan to annihilate the Jewish people, was eventually killed by right after the story. Balaam himself was killed by the Jewish people in the aftermath. So the nation that he tried to exterminate finally gets it.
I don't want to get off topic, but
Yeah, I have to be so much. Yeah.
what do you mean Job wanted to cry out but no one would listen? He was given the opportunity to verbalize anger towards God, and he didn't repeatedly. Right?
He doesn't.
Right.
Right, and he accepts God's judgment.
Right.
So because he realizes that he's being punished for the fact that when he had a chance to cry out to God for somebody else, and he chose not to. He chose to remain silent because he didn't want to jeopardize his position with Pharaoh. And so his punishment was that he wants to. Of course, he had this, but he realized that what he's being punished for was that he had an opportunity where, in other words, that good people who do nothing in the face of genocide are complicit. You can't be neutral and say I didn't do anything. No, if you stand by and do nothing, it means that you were okay with it, right? So that story is a story of that he realizes what's happening, and he accepts that he has to take it in silence and realize that that's his teshuva, right?
Is that the same thing as
I'm sorry, and I do want to say that there is an opinion in the Talmud that the story of Job is not literal. It's that Moses is the one who wrote the story of Job. And there is an opinion that it's a metaphor for life, but there is an opinion in the Talmud that the story literally happened that way. Yeah.
Is it the same thing as let's say putting a barrier in front of a blind? What was that? You shall not put a barrier in front of a blind person because of that. In a way, he didn't say anything, and Pharaoh was blind at that. I mean, Not blind as in
Putting a
blind.
barrier in front of a blind person is something active. It can't be something that's done, that where you don't have, you don't do an action to do it.
Right.
The prohibition of that is that you do something proactive, that a person stumbles literally or figuratively, that you give a person bad advice, and that person uses that advice because you want them to mess up, right, for your benefit. So that's a prohibition. Not saying something when you should say something is not a prohibition, but not saying, but not standing up for when someone is about to kill somebody and you stand. There's a separate prohibition called lo ta'amod adam re'echa. You're not allowed to stand idly by when someone's life is on the line, and that's a separate prohibition in the Torah. That in that case, you are not standing and doing nothing is a prohibition, because usually the Torah only prohibits doing something negative, physical. But in this case, when someone's about to be hurt and you even don't do anything, you can't say, well, I didn't do anything. Not doing anything in that case is doing something. But it's a separate prohibition. But there are legal parameters to it, and the question is, do you have to endanger yourself? To what degree do you have to put yourself on the line to save somebody? And that's not for tonight.
I have a really quick
Thank
question.
Sure, go.
Okay, so they keep referring to God came to Balaam, God said to Balaam, but then when they talk about Moses, they say Hashem spoke to Moses. So is it because he is inferior, or why is it only God, 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 but then when it comes to Moses, it's different?
So I said, the language is different because the language of God to Moshe is transcendent. The word Adonai refers to Elohim is the God of nature. So God reveals to Balaam in a much more concealed way, where God reveals to Moshe in a much more transcendent way. The name Adonai is God was, is, and will be. It means that God transcends nature. Elohim is the way God communicates to us through nature, right? So Balaam receives this communication through veils of nature, while Moshe was able to get a directive that didn't come. It wasn't a warped, concealed message, or through tzimtzum, which means that the message comes restricted through. It's not an open, direct revelation. So, but that's the God communicates through a number of different names. So Elohim is the God of nature. It's the gematria of Elohim is nature, by the way, and it's also the name that God uses in creation of the world. Bereshit bara Elohim. When God is discussing nature, that name of God is used. But when God is transcending nature, the other name of God is generally used. That's how it's understood.